Thank you for joining us for another Campfire ghost story. Just a reminder to all of our listeners that each story does not necessarily have a ghost in it. It might have a werewolf or a zombie or some other wee beastie, or it might just have, a deep sense of dread and foreboding that sticks with you for a little while. Either way, you'll get spooked. But just wanted to make that clear. Not always specifically a ghost. Okay. Today, we'll be reading The Gray Man by Sarah Orne Jewett. Let's begin. High on the southern slope of Agamenticus, there may still be seen the remnant of an old farm. Frost-shaken stone walls surround vast narrowing expanse of smooth turf which the forest is overgrowing on every side. The cellar is nearly filled up, never having been either wide or deep, and the fruit of a few mossy apple trees drops ungathered to the ground. Along one side of the forsaken garden is a thicket of seedling cherry trees, to which the shouting robins come year after year in busy flights. The caterpillars' nests are unassailed and populous in this untended hedge. At night, perhaps, when summer twilights are late in drawing their brown curtain of dusk over the great rural scene, at night an owl may sit in the hemlocks nearby and hoot and shriek until the far echoes answer back again. As for the few men and women who pass this deserted spot, most will be repulsed by such loneliness, will even grow impatient with those mistaken fellow beings who choose to live in solitude, away from neighbors and from schools, yes, even from gossip and petty care of self or knowledge of the trivial fashions of a narrow life. Now and then, one looks out from this eyrie across the widespread country, who turns to look at the sea or toward the shining foreheads of the mountains that guard the inland horizon, who will remember the place long afterward. A peaceful vision will come, full of rest and benediction into busy and troubled hours, to those who understand why someone came to live in this place, so near the sky, so silent, so full of sweet air and woodland fragrance, so beaten and buffeted by winter storms and garlanded with summer greenery, where the birds are nearest neighbors, and a clear spring the only wine cellar, and trees of the forest a choir of singers who rejoice and sing aloud by day and night as the winds sweep over. Under the cherry thicket, or at the edge of the woods, you may find a stray-away blossom, some half-savage, slender grandchild of the old flower plots, that you gather gladly to take away. And every year in June, a red rose blooms toward which the wild pink roses and the pale sweet briars turn wondering faces, as if a queen had shown her noble face suddenly at a peasant's festival. There is everywhere a token of remembrance, of silence and secrecy. Some stronger nature once ruled these neglected trees and this fallow ground. They will wait the return of their master, as long as roots can creep through mold and the mold may make way for them. The stories of strange lives have been whispered to the earth. Their thoughts have burned themselves into the cold rocks. As one looks from the lower country toward the long slope of the great hillside, this old, abiding place marks the dark covering of trees like a scar. There is nothing to hide, either the sunrise or the sunset. The lowlands reach out of sight into the west, and the sea fills all the east. The first owner of the farm was a seafaring man who had, through freak or fancy, come ashore and cast himself upon the bounty of nature for support in his later years, though tradition keeps a suspicion of buried treasure and of a dark history. He cleared his land and built his house, but save the fact that he was a Scotsman, no one knew to whom he belonged, and when he died, the state inherited the unclaimed property. The only piece of woodland that was worth anything was sold and added to another farm, and the dwelling place was left to the sunshine and the rain, to the birds that built their nests in the chimney or under the eaves. Sometimes, a strolling company of country boys would find themselves near the house on a holiday afternoon. But the more dilapidated the small structure became, the more they believed that some uncanny existence possessed the lonely place, and the path that led toward the clearing at last became almost impassable. Once, a number of officers and men in the employ of the Coast Survey were encamped at the top of the mountain, and they smoothed the rough track that led down to the spring that bubbled from under a sheltering edge. One day, a laughing fellow, not content with peering in at the small windows of the house, put his shoulder against the rain-blackened door and broke the simple fastening. He hardly knew that he was afraid as he first stood within the single, spacious room. So complete a curiosity took possession of him. The place was clean and bare. The empty cupboard doors stood open, and yet the sound of his companions' voices outside seemed far away, and an awful sense that some unseen inhabitant followed his footsteps made him hurry out again, pale and breathless, to the fresh air and sunshine. Was this really a dwelling place of spirits, as had been already hinted? The story grew more fearful and spread quickly like a mist of terror among the lowland farms. For years, the tale of the Coast Surveyor's adventure in the haunted house was slowly magnified and told to strangers or to wide-eyed children by the dim firelight. The former owner was supposed to linger still about his home, and was held accountable for deep offense in choosing for the scene of his unsuccessful husbandry a place that escaped the properties and restraints of life upon lower levels. His grave was concealed by the new growth of oaks and beeches, and many a lad and full-grown man beside had taken to his heels at the flicker of light from across a swamp or under a decaying tree in that neighborhood. As the world in some respects grew wiser, the good people near the mountain understood less and less the causes of these simple effects, and as they became familiar with the visible world, grew more shy of the unseen and more sensitive to unexplained foreboding. One day, a stranger was noticed in the town, as a stranger is sure to be, who goes his way with quick, furtive steps, straight through a small village or along a country road. This man was tall and had just passed middle age. He was well-made and vigorous, but there was an unusual pallor in his face, a grayish look, as if he had been startled by bad news. His clothes were somewhat peculiar, as if they had been made in another country, yet they suited the chilly weather, being homespun of undyed wools, just the color of his hair, and only a little darker than his face or hands. Someone observed in one brief glance as he and this gray man met and passed each other, that his eyes had a strange, faded look. They might, however, flash and be coal-black in a moment of rage. 2 or 3 persons stepped forward to watch the wayfarer as he went along the road with long, even strides, like one taking a journey on foot, but he quickly reached a turn of the way and was out of sight. They wondered who he was. One recalled some recent advertisement of an escaped criminal, and another the appearance of a native of the town who was supposed to be long ago lost at sea, but one surmiser knew as little as the next. If they had followed fast enough, they might have tracked the mysterious man straight across the country, threading the byways, the shorter paths that led across the fields where the road was roundabout and hindering. At last, he disappeared in the leafless, trackless woods that skirted the mountain. That night, there was for the first time in many years a twinkling light in the window of the haunted house, high on the hill's great shoulder. One farmer's wife and another looked up curiously, while they wondered what daring human being had chosen that awesome spot of all others for his home or even a transient shelter. The sky was already heavy with snow. He might be a fugitive from justice, and the startled people looked to the fastening of their doors unwontedly that night, and waked often from troubled sleep. An instinctive curiosity and alarm possessed the country men and women for a while, but soon faded out and disappeared. The newcomer was by no means a hermit. He tried to be friendly, and inclined towards a certain kindliness and familiarity. He bought a comfortable store of winter provisions from his new acquaintances, giving every one his price, and spoke more at length as time went on of current events, of politics and the weather, and the town's own news and concerns. There was a sober cheerfulness about the man, as if he had known trouble and perplexity, and was fulfilling some mission that gave him pain. Yet he saw some gain and reward beyond. Therefore, he could be contented with his life and such strange surroundings. He was more and more eager to form brotherly relations with the farmers near his home. There was almost a pleading look in his face, as if he feared the later prejudice of his associates. Surely, this was no common or uneducated person, for in every way he left the stamp of his character and influence upon men and things. His reasonable words of advice and warning are current as sterling coins in that region yet. To one man, he taught a new rotation of crops. To another, he gave some priceless cures for devastating diseases of cattle. The lonely women of those remote country homes learned of him how to achieve their household toil with less labor and drudgery, and here and there he singled out promising children and kept watch of their growth, giving freely a most affectionate companionship and a fair start in the journey of life. He taught those who were guardians of such children to recognize and further the true directions and purposes of existence, and the easily warped natures grew strong and well established under his thoughtful care. No wonder that some people were filled with amazement, and thought his wisdom supernatural, from so many proofs that his horizon was wider than their own. Perhaps some envious soul, or one aggrieved by being caught in treachery or deception, was the first to find fault with the stranger. The prejudice against his dwelling place, and the superstition which had become linked to him in consequence, may have led back to the first suspicious attitude of the community. The whisper of distrust soon started on an evil way. If he were not a criminal, his past was surely a hidden one, and shocking to his remembrance. But the true foundation of all dislike was the fact that the gray man who went to and fro, living his simple, harmless life among them, never was seen to smile. Persons who remember him speak of this with a shudder, for nothing is more evident than that his peculiarity became at length intolerable to those whose minds lent themselves readily to suspicion. At first, blinded by the gentle good fellowship of the stranger, the changeless expression of his face was scarcely observed, but as the winter wore away, he was watched with renewed disbelief and dismay. After the first few attempts at gaiety, nobody tried to tell a merry story in his presence. The most conspicuous of a joker's audience does a deep, rankling injustice if he sits with unconscious, unamused face at the receipt of raillery. What a chilling moment when the gray man softly opened the door of a farmhouse kitchen and seated himself like a skeleton at the feast of walnuts and roasted apples beside the glowing fire. The children whom he treated so lovingly, to whom he ever gave his best, though they were won at first by his gentleness, when they began to prattle and play with him, would raise their innocent eyes to his face, and hush their voices, and creep away out of his sight. Once only he was bidden to a wedding, but never afterward, for a gloom was quickly spread throughout the boisterous company. The man who never smiled had no place at such a festival. The wedding guests looked over their shoulders again and again in strange foreboding while he was in the house, and were burdened with a sense of coming woe for the newly married pair. As one caught sight of his among the faces of the rural folk, the gray man was like a somber mask. And at last the bridegroom flung open the door with a meaning gesture, and the stranger went out like a hunted creature into the bitter coldness and silence of the winter night. Through the long days of the next summer, the outcast of the wedding, forbidden at length all the once proffered hospitality, was hardly seen from one week's end to another's. He cultivated his poor estate with patient care, and the successive crops of his small garden, the fruits and berries of the wilderness, were food enough. He seemed unchangeable, and was always ready, when he even guessed at a chance to be of use. If he were repulsed, he only turned away and went back to his solitary home. Those persons who by chance visited him tell wonderful tales of the wild birds which had been tamed to come at his call and cluster about him, of the orderliness and delicacy of his simple life. The once neglected house was covered with vines that he had brought from the woods and planted about the splintering, decaying walls. There were 3 or 4 books in worn bindings on a shelf above the fireplace. One longs to know what volumes this mysterious exile had chosen to keep him company. There may have been a deeper reason for the withdrawal of friendliness. There are vague rumors of the gray man's possession of strange powers. Some say that he was gifted with amazing strength, and once, when some belated hunters found shelter at his fireside, they told eager listeners afterward that he did not sleep, but sat by the fire reading gravely while they slumbered uneasily on his own bed of boughs. And in the dead of night, an empty chair glided silently toward him across the floor as he softly turned his pages in the flickering light. But such stories are too vague, and in that neighborhood too common to weigh against the true dignity and bravery of the man. At the beginning of the War of the Rebellion, he seemed strangely troubled and disturbed, and presently disappeared, leaving his house key with a neighbor as if for a few days' absence. He was last seen striding rapidly through the village a few miles away, going back along the road by which he had come a year or 2 before. No, not last seen either, for in one of the first battles of the war, as the smoke suddenly lifted, a farmer's boy, reared in the shadow of the mountain, opened his languid, pain-dulled eyes as he lay among the wounded, and saw the gray man riding by on a tall horse. At that moment, the poor lad thought in his faintness and fear that Death himself rode by in the gray man's likeness, unsmiling Death, who tries to teach and serve mankind so that he may at the last win welcome as a faithful friend. So ends our story today. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you'll join us again next week for another spooky story. Thanks very much.